In our last episode, we discussed President James K. Polk's unlikely rise to the White House and his success in annexing Texas and settling the Oregon Territory. But by late April 1846, he was leading his nation to war with its southern neighbor, Mexico. As a former dark horse candidate with no military experience, many wondered whether Polk had what it took to win the war. And even more questioned whether Polk's war was a just war. At stake were his presidency and the future of his country. The story of that war, and its legacy for our nation, is the subject of this episode of This American President, The Great American Conqueror, Part 2. America hadn't seen a major war since the War of 1812, about 30 years earlier. Polk didn't have an array of commanders to choose from. Although he had Taylor down by the Rio Grande, where all the action was, he needed someone to serve as the commander of American forces. On May 13, 1846, Polk chose a man named Winfield Scott. Now this is someone definitely worth looking up. Feel free to Google image him. Scott was one of the most memorable men in American military history. By the start of the war, he was almost 60 years old. Like Taylor, he came from a wealthy Virginia family and had had a long career going all the way back to the War of 1812. Like Jackson, he was brash and courageous. He once took a bullet to the shoulder and even broke his collarbone in battle. He survived those experiences and rose quickly, becoming, at the age of 27, the youngest Army general in America at the time. But he was also a bit of a diva. Like Jackson, he had a quick temper and didn't take well to slights. He was extremely vain and loved dressing in fancy uniforms. As a result, he earned the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers. But he was also brilliant. He was known as an intellectual with an impressive grasp of military history and strategy. So Polk had two vain, hardened men running his war, Old Rough and Ready Zachary Taylor and Old Fuss and Feathers Winfield Scott. You just don't get nicknames like this anymore. But Scott and Polk didn't have a good start to their relationship. Scott was a known Whig and began hearing rumors that Polk was staffing the army mainly with Democrats so that no Whig could rise to the top of military glory. Polk also heard that Scott would stay in Washington until the fall, when he would take command. Scott's lack of urgency alarmed Polk, and after Polk met Scott, he reportedly said, quote, "General Scott did not impress me favorably as a military man." Either way, Polk, Scott, and Secretary of War Marcy met to design the war strategy. They agreed to focus on capturing northern Mexico to force the Mexican government to negotiate. And while the conquest of northern Mexico was going on, they planned another force that would conquer the Mexican lands America wanted, specifically New Mexico and California. And they sent to Congress a request to boost the army by 20,000 men. Very early in the war, Zachary Taylor got two quick victories. On May 8, 1846, he defeated General Arista in the Battle of Palo Alto. The next day, he defeated General Arista again at the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. During the battle, a 24-year-old quartermaster named Ulysses S. Grant led a daring cavalry charge and carried a dispatch through sniper-lined straits. He did so in Chuck Norris-like fashion while hanging off the side of his horse and successfully delivering the dispatch. Taylor was outnumbered both times, but within just 2 days, Taylor's men killed 256 Mexicans while losing only 37. It was a sign that Mexico had no chance of overcoming America's military superiority. With all of that said, Polk seems to take a gamble at this point. Remember when President Polk met with Alejandro Atocha? He was the one who proposed that Polk help the exiled leader Santa Anna return to power in Mexico, and in exchange, Santa Anna would sell large Mexican territories to the United States. Well, it seems that Polk decided to take Atocha and Santa Anna up on the offer. So on May 13th, Polk ordered Commodore Connor, still blockading Mexican ports in the Gulf, to permit Santa Anna to pass through the blockade and enter Mexico. Polk was taking a huge gamble that the opportunistic Santa Anna would remain a man of his word and deliver the territories he wanted. Through a back channel, Polk conveyed to Santa Anna what he wanted, the Rio Grande as the recognized border of Texas, and the acquisition of California, including San Francisco. In response, Santa Anna signaled his acceptance of those terms by the summer of 1846, and even discussed which strategy would best help the United States against his own country. As Taylor was succeeding in northern Mexico, Polk knew this was the time to strike in New Mexico and California. On May 26th, Polk and his cabinet unanimously decided to raise a force under Colonel Stephen Kearny in Independence, Missouri. Kearny and his men were tasked with the goal to take Santa Fe and, after taking it by force, conquer California. Despite America's military successes, Polk was still looking to end the war quickly through a cash payment, so long as the U.S. acquired its desired territories. Through a back channel to Mexican President Mariano Paredes, he let it be known that he would be willing to talk. And he even proposed to members of Congress, in confidence, to allocate $2 million to be offered to Mexico as compensation. Polk hoped that the offer of cash would be enough to get Mexico to sue for peace on America's terms. Now, the $2 million deserves to be discussed here at length. In the House, an event happened that changed the complexion of the war and changed the nation forever, and, at the time, few people had expected it. During the debate over the expenditure, a young freshman Democrat from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot proposed a resolve to be attached to Polk's request. It stated that slavery would be excluded from any territory acquired in the war. Wilmot was a member of the Van Buren faction of the party, which leaned anti-slavery. He also supported Polk's war. Interestingly enough, Wilmot had no history of abolition. In fact, as a supporter of states' rights, he at times fought the federal government's intervention into slavery. Wilmot was among those who believed slavery would die out if restricted. He once said, quote, "Keep it within given limits, and in time it will wear itself out. Its existence can only be perpetuated by constant expansion. Slavery has within itself the seeds of its own destruction." Still, Wilmot's proviso did what many feared it would do. It introduced the most divisive issue in America into the war, the one issue many people, including the founders themselves, believed could split apart the country. Polk was stunned. He argued that the slavery issue wasn't even really relevant to the war. None of the lands Polk desired had slavery, nor was it clear that they were conducive to it. Polk felt that the Wilmot proviso was a, quote, mischievous and foolish amendment, and added that, quote, "what connection slavery had making peace with Mexico is difficult to conceive." Polk feared that this would prevent getting the $2 million from Congress to negotiate an end to the war. He was right to be fearful. The House ended up passing the $2 million in the proviso, but the Senate refused to do so. Polk now couldn't dangle the carrot of $2 million before Mexico. For the president, it was a severe blow, and he lamented that the war could be prolonged due to politics. He wrote, quote, "Had the appropriation been passed, I am confident I should have made an honorable peace by which we should have acquired California and such other territories we desired before the end of October." Polk knew his legacy was at stake, and this represented a major blow. Now, the situation in California was a bit complicated. It was no secret that the Americans desired California. Its acquisition could provide a gateway to trade with the Far East and would complete the dream to make America a continental power. But Polk had further reasons for urgency. The previous year, in October 1845, this was before the war started, Polk heard rumors that the British Hudson Bay Company was considering offering Mexico cash to acquire California. Remember, at this time, Britain still wasn't out of Oregon. Polk also heard that the British were planning to boost its fleet in the Pacific. To Polk, this sounded like Britain was about to make a play for North America's west coast. Acquiring California was now a national security imperative. Things were happening in California somewhat unrelated to Polk's actions. An American explorer named John C. Fremont had just arrived there. He was a pioneer type who was in California supposedly to chart maps, but in reality he was looking for routes that could boost American immigration into the region. He raised the suspicions of the Mexican governor there, Jose Castro, who expelled him. Fremont responded by building a fort on Monterey, and in a provocative move, raised the flag of the United States. On April 17, 1846, Castro ordered all non-Mexican citizens out of California and encouraged Native Americans to attack American settlers. With that, the settlers broke out in revolt. Fremont did all of this without any knowledge that war had broken out with Mexico, nor did he have any authorization from Washington, D.C. But he basically provoked a white uprising in California against the Mexican government. With all of that said, Polk sent a secret message to America's envoys in California that the United States would come to their aid. Well, once Castro's actions provoked the revolt, an American commander named John Sloat took advantage of the situation and seized Monterey on July 7th, while his deputy took San Francisco. Meanwhile, Kearny's mission had departed from Independence, Missouri on June 26th on its way to Santa Fe. He had a 900-mile, 2-month journey through the Rocky Mountains ahead of him. Polk also sent a man named James McGuffin to Santa Fe ahead of Kearny to persuade his old friend, New Mexican Governor Manuel Armijo, to step down peacefully. Armijo responded defiantly and pledged to fight, but when Kearny arrived in Santa Fe, he fled. By August 18, 1846, Kearny had conquered New Mexico, a large piece of territory with about 80,000 people, with no resistance, and installed a government there. A month later, he set out for California. Back in California, another American Commodore, Robert Stockton, began conquering Southern California. At almost the same time Kearny secured New Mexico, Stockton took Los Angeles and declared that all of California was now under the American flag. And just like that, the United States had captured what was becoming the entire Southwest with an almost laughable number of casualties. Among those sent to California to help administer the new government was a 27-year-old lieutenant, William Tecumseh Sherman. Despite all this, Mexico refused to come to the table. Polk sent them a peace overture in late July as California was slipping away from Mexico's grip. He still hoped to work out some deal to buy California and New Mexico, despite having already taken it by force. But by September 1846, Polk received an answer from Mexico. They would not agree to talks. One historian believes that Mexico thought that one battle victory could give it sufficient bargaining position. And Polk soon heard about Santa Anna's return to Mexico City. He was banking that Santa Anna would make good on his side of the bargain and bring Mexico into talks with the United States. But once Santa Anna arrived in the capital city, he appeared to renege on his agreement. Instead of helping the U.S., Santa Anna now vowed to lead the war effort against it. Santa Anna proclaimed, quote, "Mexicans, there was once a day, and my heart dilates with the remembrance. You saluted me with the title of Soldier of the People. Allow me to take it again, never more to be given up, and to devote myself, until death, to the defense of liberty and the independence of the Republic." It was stunning, but then again, this was Santa Anna. Everyone knew that dealing with him was risky. Still, Polk did have the upper hand over Mexico. He formulated a new strategy. Now he would no longer offer Mexico the face-saving gesture of a financial exchange. He would hold onto the newly acquired territories while assaulting the heart of Mexico. The centerpiece of the assault would be an amphibious landing on Veracruz. It was a daring plan, but something that a daring president was willing to do. After Taylor's stunning victories back in May, he headed to the city of Monterey, also in northern Mexico. Despite his success, Polk still didn't think much of Taylor, saying he lacked the, quote, grasp of mind. It also didn't help that Taylor stopped communicating with Polk and the Secretary of War, which annoyed and frustrated the president and his cabinet. When Taylor did send messages to Polk, they were usually rude and unprofessional. Still, Taylor won battles. At Monterey, from September 21st to the 24th, Taylor confronted Mexican General Pedro de Ampadilla and incurred high casualties, but emerged victorious. In the aftermath, Ampadilla requested that Taylor not take any POWs, since he claimed America and Mexico were engaged in peace talks. That was a lie, but Taylor complied. When Polk got word of Taylor's decision, he was enraged, believing that Taylor's act of mercy would prolong the war. Polk wrote of Taylor, quote, "I have no prejudice against him, but think he has acted with great weakness and folly." He also believed that Taylor, like Secretary of State Buchanan, had his eye on the presidency. Things would get even worse. Soon a letter Taylor wrote to his son-in-law bashing the president was published by a Whig newspaper, the New York Express. Even worse, the letter revealed the position of his troops. This obviously would be a reason for firing Taylor, but the lack of potential replacements made that impossible. Instead, Polk just had Secretary of War Marcy write Taylor a letter reprimanding him. As Polk was preparing for the Veracruz invasion, more trouble arose. First, a newspaper in New Orleans called La Patria somehow got word of the deal Polk had made with Santa Anna. Now, it's very common in the past several decades for things to leak out of the White House, to endless frustration for many presidents. While this is nothing new, it even happened in the 1840s. Word spread about this bargain, which made Polk look like he was being duped by Santa Anna. It was an embarrassment. Members of Congress began distancing themselves from the administration. Second, the Whigs did well during the midterm elections, gaining 31 seats in the House. Despite these setbacks, as 1846 drew to a close, Polk had several stunning successes in a very short period of time. America now possessed Texas, New Mexico, Oregon, and California. His vision of a continental nation was coming together. But he still had to close the deal. He needed Mexico to capitulate. And now that Santa Anna had fooled him, he was going to show no mercy. At the start of 1847, General Taylor continued giving Polk fits. Contrary to Polk's orders, Taylor had divided up his force into two at Monterey. Of Taylor, Polk wrote, quote, "If General Taylor is in any danger, as I greatly fear he is, it is in consequences of his having, in violation of his orders, advanced beyond Monterey. The truth is that from the beginning of the war he has been constantly blundering into difficulties, but has fought out of them, but at the cost of many lives." On February 22nd, Santa Anna confronted Taylor at Buena Vista, again in northern Mexico. Santa Anna had a numerical advantage of 3-1. Despite the odds against him and his acts of insubordination to the president, Taylor won a stunning victory. Among those serving under Taylor was his son-in-law, 38-year-old Jefferson Davis, who fought bravely and was shot in the leg. Taylor's fourth straight victory, once again against superior numbers, made him a national hero. No one knew anything about his politics or his principles, but they knew he could win. And the Whigs were salivating at the prospect of running him in 1848. But his commander-in-chief was not impressed. Polk believed that the victory brought few strategic gains and incurred a high level of American casualties. It's not hard to imagine that Polk also worried that Taylor could now be destined for the White House, perhaps as a Whig. But Polk's frustration couldn't compare to the grief felt by Henry Clay. The former Whig nominee's son, Henry Jr., was at the battle and was one of its casualties. It was a bitter irony that his son was killed in a war he opposed, led by the man who defeated him. Polk and his cabinet began to formulate the invasion of Veracruz. They planned, once the landing occurred, that the army would attack the fortress of San Juan de Ulloa. Polk knew that he had to increase troop levels, so he planned on requesting 35,000 men. With General Taylor in northern Mexico, Old Fuss and Feathers Winfield Scott was assigned to lead the invasion. The question was what to do once the invasion succeeded. Should the army hold on to territory or push into Mexico, maybe even taking the capital, Mexico City? On this, the cabinet was divided. Secretary of State Buchanan believed that the path to Mexico City would be bloody and not worth the risk. On March 9, 1847, Scott and a force of 12,000 men landed near Veracruz. With him were young officers Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Jackson, also known as Stonewall Jackson. From there, they attacked Mexican General Juan Morales and the fortress of San Juan de Ulloa. By March 27, 1847, Morales surrendered. Scott then faced Santa Anna at the Battle of Cerro Gordo on April 18th. It was a disaster for Santa Anna. Though outnumbering Scott, he lost over 1,000 men, while Scott just lost 263. With these two victories, there was little to stop Scott on the way to the Mexican capital. Things were looking worse and worse for Mexico. It was during this time that Polk would give Mexico one last opportunity for a settlement. It seems that he still hadn't given up on some sort of financial inducement for Mexico to end the war. After meeting with his cabinet, Polk decided to send Nicholas Trist to Mexico City to negotiate. Trist had an interesting career, as he seemed to always be hanging around the giants of the age. He studied under Thomas Jefferson and even married Jefferson's granddaughter. He then served as Andrew Jackson's personal secretary. In 1833, he was appointed by President Jackson as U.S. consul in Havana, Cuba. Unfortunately, Trist was known for being a staunch supporter of slavery, and during his appointment in Cuba, was involved in the illegal slave trade. He was soon recalled and investigated. Although he was exonerated of any wrongdoing, his reputation took a hit. But he still had friends in high places, one of them being Secretary of State Buchanan, who helped him get the number 2 position at the State Department. It was quite a remarkable comeback. Well, for whatever reason, Trist was the man Polk entrusted with negotiating the end to the war. It was a critical task, maybe the most important of the Polk administration. The president and his cabinet swore Trist to secrecy and gave him very specific instructions. Trist was to demand that the border between the United States and Mexico extend from the Rio Grande in Texas to the Pacific Ocean, basically what it is today. This would ensure that what is currently the American Southwest and all of California would come under the United States. In exchange, the United States would assume all of its citizens' claims against Mexico and pay an additional $15 to $30 million for all of the new territories. At any rate, Trist arrived at Veracruz on May 6, 1847. When Trist got there, General Scott expected that Trist would meet with him and directly give him instructions from Polk. Instead of meeting with Scott directly, Trist sent the general a message via courier and claimed he had the authority to instruct Scott. This outraged the proud General Scott, who wrote to Trist, quote, "I see that the Secretary of War proposes to degrade me by requiring that I, the commander of this army, shall defer to you, the chief clerk of the Department of State, the question of continuing or discontinuing hostilities." Scott also wrote to Secretary Marcy, where he basically attacked both Trist and the president, and said, quote, "I entreat to be spared the personal dishonor of being again required to obey the orders of the chief clerk of the State Department." Describing Scott, Trist wrote to his wife that he was, quote, "decidedly the greatest imbecile that I ever had anything to do with." The Trist mission was clearly not going well. When Polk learned of all the back and forth, he lamented that, quote, "the golden moment to make a peace may be lost because of General Scott's arrogance and insubordinate vanity." Still, he knew that, with the delicacy of the situation, he couldn't afford to fire either Scott or Trist. It's fascinating to think about all of this. America's leaders during a time of war engaging in such petty quarrels. Polk must have felt boxed in, considering that he thought very little of his 2 top generals, Scott and Taylor. But it's nothing new in American history. During Washington's presidency, the great Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were often bickering. Under Jackson, it was Jackson versus everyone else. Lincoln fired multiple generals, and one of them even ran against him for president. And then we get Bobby Kennedy versus Lyndon Johnson or Colin Powell versus Donald Rumsfeld. It's just another reminder of just how human our government is, even at the highest levels. At any rate, something strange happened right afterwards. When Trist and Scott met, they discovered they actually had a great deal in common. They were even kindred spirits. Somehow, in a very short period of time, they ended up burying the hatchet, going from bitter enemies to close friends. Trist was soon writing that his friendship with Scott had, quote, "so much good feeling that it afforded me the sincerest pleasure to meet it as I did, in a way which should at once preclude all constraint and embarrassment between us." Even better, by June of 1847, they began hearing rumors that Santa Anna was willing to talk. And this is where several high-level diplomats, including Scott and Trist, begin discussing something totally outside their instructions. These men began considering bribing Santa Anna about $1 million to bring about the end of the war. The transaction would have to be made in secret. Trist wrote to Scott in mid-July, quote, "We are both convinced that the only way in which the indefinite protraction of this war can possibly be prevented is by the secret expenditure of money at the City of Mexico." Scott suggested that he had enough money in his war fund to make the payment. They knew that the bribe was completely unauthorized, but they justified it by saying that it would end the war. It very well could have happened, but the Mexican Congress, suspicious of Santa Anna, stripped him of any power to negotiate the peace. Throughout the entire affair, Polk knew nothing of the bribery scheme. By now, Polk and his cabinet were getting antsy over Mexico's unwillingness to talk. They began discussing even stronger military action. This meant, again, dispensing with the offer for payments and conquering more territory from Mexico. Some members of his cabinet even floated the idea of taking over the whole country. Imagine if America had conquered all of Mexico. Polk decided to hold off on a decision until further news arrived. During these deliberations, Scott and his army were on their way to the Mexican capital. On August 19th and 20th, he confronted Santa Anna at the Battle of Contreras and Churubusco. Once again, Scott was outnumbered by Santa Anna, but once again the Americans won. Scott was just outside Mexico City. Santa Anna then asked for a truce, and the Mexican government announced that they would be willing to receive tryst. One would think that Mexico had had enough, but Santa Anna, as can be expected, broke the truce agreement by boosting his military position and blocking Americans from obtaining basic supplies. Scott ended the truce on September 7, 1847, and began attacking Mexico City. Again, Scott was outnumbered 2-1, but Santa Anna had spread his men around the city, thinning his force. By September 15th, Scott was victorious. He rode down Mexico City, the conquering general. Santa Anna fled the city. It was the culmination of a spectacular invasion. Scott took about 11,000 men and defeated Santa Anna's 30,000 men over several battles in the heart of enemy territory. The man who defeated Napoleon, the Duke of Wellington, declared Scott, quote, the greatest living soldier, and his campaign as, quote, unsurpassed in military annals. It was, up until that time, the greatest display of American military force projection. Meanwhile, Trist was engaged in intense talks with the Mexican government. With the Americans in control, he expected to find the Mexicans willing to deal. But believe it or not, the Mexican government continued to refuse. They refused to pay American claims or give up any of New Mexico or Southern California, despite them being under American control. They also refused to recognize the Rio Grande as the border and further insisted on the Nueces farther east as the border. They demanded that, at most, the area between the two rivers would be considered neutral territory. It was at this point Trist miscalculated. He believed Polk might be willing to consider the proposal for the neutral zone and sent it to the president. When Polk received the proposal, he now believed Trist was not tough enough to obtain the territory he wanted. On October 4th, 1847, the president decided to recall Trist from his mission. In their eyes, Trist's mission was now over. Polk and his cabinet deliberated on what to do next. Buchanan was back to being difficult. Once he had advised against Scott's invasion of Veracruz, now he was siding with those who wanted to take over the entire nation of Mexico. This only added to Polk's belief that Buchanan was posturing for the presidency the next year. When the war was uncertain, Polk was reticent to act, but as the war became more successful, he became more and more gung-ho. He didn't want to look like he was against a successful war. By October, Polk resolved to renew the war effort. He would offer no more peace proposals and would put the ball in Mexico's court. Meanwhile, he ordered the army to hold all the territory it captured and establish permanent territorial governments. But in Mexico, things were changing. The failure of the war effort led to the fall of the government. Santa Anna again had fallen out of favor. In their place was a more moderate government, led by President Pedro Maria de Anaya and Foreign Minister Manuel Peña y Peña. Trist felt optimistic that the new leadership would be willing to restart talks. But just as he was trying to engage the new government, on November 16, 1847, he received the crushing news of his recall. Trist now saw that Polk had taken a hard line. He feared that this would destroy the possibility of any peace between the two nations. Trist was waiting to be escorted out of Mexico City, but there was a delay in forming an escort team, so he stayed in the capital. On November 24, 1847, Trist received a note from Minister Peña saying that Mexico was ready to talk. Had the escort party been formed on time, Trist would never have received the note. It was at this point that Trist began considering something that would result in major historical consequences. He kept thinking about the possibility of disobeying the president's recall note and negotiating a deal with the Mexicans. On the one hand, if the talks failed, Trist could be held in contempt of the president. On the other hand, if he succeeded, he would be a hero, and Polk might be forced to accept the treaty. And on top of that, Trist really believed that Polk's taking a hard line was squandering away the chance for peace. It was at this point that a friend wrote to Trist, quote, "Make the treaty. Make the treaty, sir. It is now in your power to do your country a greater service than any living man can render her. You are bound to do it. Instruction or no instructions, you are bound to do it. Your country, sir, is entitled to this service from you. Do it, sir." In response, Trist replied, quote, "I will make the treaty." During the winter of 1847 to 48, Polk learned the stunning news that Trist went rogue and resumed negotiations with Mexican officials. Polk pointed the finger at Scott, saying Trist is, quote, "acting, no doubt, upon General Scott's advice. He seems to have entered into Scott's hatred of the administration and to be lending himself to all Scott's evil purposes." 10 days later, Buchanan got a long letter from Trist attacking Polk and defending Scott, saying, quote, "Infallibility of judgment is not among the attributes of the President of the United States." Polk was enraged and described Trist as arrogant, impudent, and very insulting to his government, and even personally offensive to the president. Despite all of this, Polk didn't send out another recall notice to Trist, nor did he fire Scott. And despite believing Buchanan to be compromised due to his ambitions for the presidency, he also refused to fire him as well. You almost get the sense that Polk either felt trapped and that he couldn't fire them. Maybe it was because he didn't think anyone could replace them. Maybe in Trist's case, he hoped that a deal was really possible. Either way, it's a curious thing that President Polk, a man who had no problem taking enormous risks for the nation, couldn't bear risking changes in personnel. As the war dragged on, Polk felt increasing political pressures. After their gains in the midterm elections, the Whigs were emboldened and anti-war fever was at fever pitch. On January 3, 1848, the Whigs passed an amendment declaring the war had been, quote, "unnecessarily and unconstitutionally begun by the President of the United States." Democrats joined in the chorus of criticism. Senator Calhoun asked on the Senate floor, quote, "What has been accomplished? What has been done? Has the avowed object of the war been attained? Have we conquered peace? Have we attained a treaty? Have we obtained any indemnity? No, sir. We have, for all our vast expenditure of money, for all the loss of blood and men, we have nothing." Calhoun's argument rested on two assertions. The first was that the Mexican-American War was an act of unjustified American aggression, and that even worse, this would change the nation itself. Quote, "He who knows the American Constitution well, he who has duly studied its character, he who has looked at history and knows what has been the effect of conquest of free states, invariably will require no proof at my hands to show that it would be entirely hostile to the institutions of the country to hold Mexico as a province. The Union would become imperial, and the states mere subordinate corporations." Essentially, Calhoun was saying that conquest would turn America into a tyranny. Now, since America has been a very big country for our entire lives, it may be hard to understand Calhoun's logic here. But remember, this was the first time America annexed a large portion of territory through the use of force. Many people feared exactly what this meant. Did it mean that America was changing its character? It brought up a lot of questions. The Constitution didn't address the issue of annexation. Could republics conquer territory? Did international law apply here? The second argument was more controversial. Calhoun argued that, quote, "We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. Ours, sir, is the government of the white man, and yet it is professed and talked about to erect these Mexicans into territorial government and place them on an equality with the people of the United States. I protest utterly against such a project." Very plainly, Calhoun was claiming that America was a white man's nation. And this is where you see just how complicated history is. On the one hand, you have a man defending the principles of a republic and swearing off the actions of conquest, something many Americans on both sides can agree on. But you also have that same man defending a stance that most people today would regard as just plain racist. In the House of Representatives on January 12, 1848, a 38-year-old Whig freshman member from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln attacked President Polk in the strongest terms. He cast doubt over Polk's reasons for going to war and challenged him to, quote, show that the soil was ours where the first blood of war was shed, that it was not within an inhabited country, or, if within such, that the inhabitants had submitted themselves to the civil authority of Texas or of the United States. Lincoln charged that Polk, quote, is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him, and trusting to escape scrutiny by fixing the public gaze upon the exceeding brightness of military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood, that serpent's eye that charms to destroy. And Lincoln then attacked Polk personally, saying he was a, quote, bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed man. The war, of course, had its supporters, and many of them attacked the anti-war crowd as unpatriotic. One member, Democratic Congressman Barclay Martin, attacked his Whig colleague Meredith Poindexter Gentry as, quote, an advocate of Mexico and of Mexican aggression. Basically, he called him a traitor. And what made the war even more heated was the Wilmot Proviso and the discussion on slavery. In the Northeast, abolition continued to rise among both Democrats and Whigs. Several Southern politicians began speaking strongly against abolition. In both sides, Polk saw political opportunism. Quote, the truth is, there is no patriotism in either faction. Both desire to mount slavery as a hobby and secure the election of their favorite upon it. It made for a very ugly atmosphere in Washington, D.C., in which many felt the future of the Republic, what it meant, and what it stood for was at risk. Meanwhile, Trist continued his negotiations with the Mexican government. By now, they were taking place in a city just north of the capital, named Guadalupe Hidalgo. If any diplomat ever had any incentive to succeed, it was Trist. If he failed, he would have disobeyed his president for nothing. There were several issues that continued to divide both sides. The most difficult one was a matter of money. Trist was willing for the United States to pay up to $3 million for all claims of its citizens against Mexico. His counterparts wanted that number higher. Also, Trist had been authorized to offer up to $30 million for the new territories, but he was holding out to see if Mexico would accept $15 million. Trist then argued that if the talks failed then, no agreement could be reached, especially if he and Scott were replaced. This argument resonated with the moderate Mexican government. From there, both sides quickly came to an agreement on the issues. The Mexicans accepted $15 million for the new territories. Trist accepted a compromise on the issue of U.S. claims against Mexico, agreeing to a figure of $3.25 million. Mexico, finally, accepted the Rio Grande as the Texas border, and American ownership of all of California and large parts of what would become the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. Mexican citizens in those areas could either move back to Mexico or become U.S. citizens. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848. One Mexican official, a man named Don Bernardo Cuoto, reportedly said to Trist, quote, this must be a proud moment for you, no less proud for you than humiliating for us. In response, Trist said, quote, we are making peace. Let that be our only thought. 2 weeks later, Polk received the text of the treaty. Although he maintained that, quote, Mr. Trist has acted very badly, he did allow that, quote, it should not be rejected on account of his bad conduct. Polk then met with his cabinet to discuss the agreement. Most supported sending it to the Senate for ratification. Treasury Secretary Walker insisted that Polk reject the treaty and pushed to acquire all of Mexico. Buchanan advised that Polk should at least try to get more Mexican territory. Polk rejected their advice, and on February 23, 1848, sent the treaty to the Senate. While this was going on, there was a presidential election underway. Polk's many successes led to some of his friends suggesting that he run for a second term. After all, he was the youngest president elected up to that time, and was just 52 years old. But Polk refused, saying, quote, I am sincerely desirous to have the enjoyment of retirement and public life. His presidency had been an eventful one, and he was exhausted. He was a famed workaholic, and his health had been deteriorating. He was growing thinner by the day. During his last year at the White House, his focus would be on ending the war. There was no shortage of wannabe successors. By then, Zachary Taylor had declared himself a Whig. His victory at Buena Vista made him a national hero. But so was Winfield Scott, with his brilliant offensive into Mexico City. And then there was the perennial candidate, Henry Clay. By now he was 71 years old. He had even struck up a friendship with his former opponent, President Polk. But he remained strongly anti-war and was becoming more and more anti-slavery. The Democrats had several familiar faces aspiring to the presidency. They included Lewis Cass, John Calhoun, James Buchanan, and maybe even former President Van Buren. Personally, Polk reportedly favored Cass. Meanwhile, Buchanan continued to be a thorn in Polk's side. Around this time, a journalist named John Nugent was writing articles under a pseudonym attacking Polk and his administration and praising James Buchanan. The president believed Buchanan was behind all of this, as he was close to Nugent. Polk wrote, quote, "The truth is that the scheming and intriguing about the presidential election, and especially by Mr. Buchanan, is seriously embarrassing my administration." In March, the New York Herald got a hold of a copy of the treaty and Polk's confidential correspondence to the Senate on the issue. This was a massive breach and infuriated Polk. He again believed Buchanan was behind all of this and wrote, quote, "He has been selfish and all his acts and his opinions seem to have been controlled with a view to his own advancement, so much so that I can have no confidence or reliance in any advice he may give upon public questions." Despite these bumps in the road, the nation was strongly behind annexation. The Senate was not about to stand in their countrymen's way. On March 10, 1848, it ratified the treaty by a vote of 38 to 14. Although the war had divided both parties, the treaty was ratified with bipartisan support. Polk immediately dispatched a note to the Mexican government notifying them of ratification. Now, the Mexican government had to ratify the treaty. Polk would have to wait for a few weeks before he knew the outcome. By this time, America's representatives in Mexico headed home. Trist arrived back in the United States on May 4, 1848. Scott arrived home in New Jersey in May to a hero's welcome, but he couldn't leave well enough alone. He wrote a letter to Secretary Marcy where he cataloged all of his grievances with the administration. Once again, the letter was leaked to the newspapers, and once again, it was an embarrassment for Polk. Few times in American history has a president dealt with such a consistent level of insubordination by his generals. In late May, the Democrats convened for the National Convention in Baltimore. Cass and Buchanan were the two top candidates. Unfortunately for the ambitious Secretary of State, Lewis Cass ran away with the nomination on the fourth ballot. But many Democrats in the South felt Cass was too soft on Northern abolitionists. Those Southern Democrats were now digging in their heels and were itching to keep the new territories open to slavery. In early June, the Whigs convened in Philadelphia. Observers expected Clay to be nominated for his fourth run, but General Taylor's heroics were too much for Clay. On the fourth ballot, Taylor claimed the nomination. It was supremely ironic that the party whose many members opposed the war was now nominating one of the war's biggest heroes. For Clay, it was likely the end of any chance he had for the presidency. On June 7, 1848, Polk received word that Mexico's Chamber of Deputies ratified the treaty. On June 10th, he learned that the Mexican Senate did the same. On July 4, 1848, he received the official treaty from Mexico and promptly signed it. The war was over. With that, President James K. Polk had achieved his biggest goal and the biggest part of his legacy. But the entire issue wasn't over yet. The question now was how to establish territorial governments in the new territories. And the big issue remained slavery. By this time, both the North and the South were passionately divided on whether the new territories should include slavery. The distrust between both sides was at a fever pitch. Polk wanted to compromise. He looked back to the 1820 Missouri Compromise, which allowed the U.S. to incorporate the territories it gained in the Louisiana Purchase by allowing slavery below the 3630 line, but prohibiting it above that line. Polk wanted to extend that line all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, basically splitting the new lands from Mexico half slave and half free. But neither side would budge. The proposal was defeated in the House by a group of Northerners who refused to allow slavery to be extended. One senator, John Clayton, proposed a compromise that prohibited slavery in Oregon and allowed territorial governments to be established in California and New Mexico, but to sidestep the entire issue of slavery. Later, the judicial branch would then decide the status of slavery for all of the territories. Polk believed it was the only way out of the impasse, and he supported it. but the bill was defeated in the House, this time by Southerners who refused to allow the courts to determine the future of slavery. Polk feared that these failures would encourage New Mexico and California to declare independence. By then, Polk's presidency was ending. The issue of slavery in the new territories wouldn't be settled under Polk. It would be left to his successor. And on November 7, 1848, that successor was decided by the American people, as Zachary Taylor defeated Lewis Cass for the presidency. It must have galled Polk that the man he once said that lacked the, quote, grasp of mind and had, quote, acted with great weakness and folly would be succeeding him to the presidency. On March 5, 1849, James Polk rode in a carriage with incoming President Zachary Taylor on their way to the capital. On the way there, Taylor pondered whether it would be better for the two territories to become independent of the United States. Polk, who had spent countless hours of his grueling presidency to acquire them, was stunned by the statement. Later he would write, quote, General Taylor is, I have no doubt, a well-meaning old man. He is, however, uneducated, exceedingly ignorant of public affairs, and, I should judge, of very ordinary capacity. One can only imagine how distressed Polk felt at the prospect of his successor undoing that which he had worked so hard to achieve. Polk then watched Taylor deliver his inaugural address. That night, he and Sarah left the nation's capital for their home in Nashville, Tennessee. James K. Polk exhausted himself during his presidency. By the time he arrived home, his health had deteriorated. He was suffering from diarrhea and intense fatigue. Within weeks of returning home, he contracted cholera. By then, it became apparent that he was dying. Although he had never formally joined a church, he was baptized on his deathbed as a Methodist. On June 15, 1849, at his home in Nashville, he uttered his last words, quote, I love you, Sarah. For all eternity, I love you. He died shortly thereafter at the age of 53. His presidency had ended just 3 months earlier. It was the shortest retirement for any president to this day. Sarah Polk continued to live in her home in Nashville for another 42 years, and, ironically, enjoyed the longest retirement and widowhood of any former First Lady. To commemorate the loss of her husband, she always wore black. She died at the age of 87 on August 14, 1891. Upon taking office, President Zachary Taylor found himself hobbled by the fierce debate over the new territories. Although he was a Southern slaveholder, Taylor, like Polk, feared the issue would destroy the Union. He came out against the extension of slavery, but both sides remained at an impasse. In July of 1850, Taylor developed severe indigestion, which some believe was cholera. On July 9, 1850, he died at the age of 65, the second U.S. president to die in office. Vice President Millard Fillmore took the oath of office as the 13th president of the United States. The issue of whether to allow slavery into the new territories raged on. But in 1850, it was the aging Henry Clay, now back in the Senate, who rose to the challenge of finding a compromise. Working with the young Senator Stephen Douglas, Clay crafted a series of resolutions that he hoped could bring together enough Northerners and Southerners and forestall the possibility of civil war. The resolutions called for admitting California as a free state, allowing the territory of New Mexico and the new territory of Utah to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be slave and free, banning the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act. Although the resolutions stalled under Taylor, Fillmore was much more open to compromise. By the fall of 1850, he had signed them into law. The nation had avoided civil war for the time being. The following year, Henry Clay announced that he would resign from the Senate after almost half a century of service to the nation. He died on January 20th, 1852, of tuberculosis at the age of 75. Polk's troublesome Secretary of State James Buchanan was appointed America's ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1853 to 1856. In 1856, he achieved his ambition and was elected the 15th President of the United States. By then, the divide between the North and the South was even greater than ever. His support of the infamous Dred Scott decision, which ruled that both free and enslaved blacks were not American citizens, and the government couldn't limit the expansion of slavery into the new territories, furthered that divide. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who had just denounced Polk just 13 years earlier, was elected president. He was an avowed opponent of the extension of slavery, and his election provoked the South to secede from the Union. By the end of Buchanan's presidency, the United States was disintegrating. Throughout his retirement, Buchanan was vilified for his decisions as president, but he remained defiant, convinced that history would vindicate him. In 1866, he published a memoir where he strongly defended his term in the White House. In June of 1868, he died in his home of Pennsylvania of a respiratory ailment at the age of 77. Today, he is consistently ranked by historians as one of the worst American presidents. Winfield Scott remained a national hero after the Mexican-American War. Although Millard Fillmore was a Whig and the incumbent president in 1852, the party discarded him that year and nominated Scott as their candidate. But the Whigs were divided over the issue of slavery, and Scott lost to Franklin Pierce. Still, Scott remained a beloved American figure and was promoted to the highest position in the military. During the inauguration of President Lincoln, he was assigned to defend the Capitol from attack. He served as Lincoln's first top military advisor and developed the Anaconda Plan, which served as the Union's early strategy against the Confederacy. By then, he was in his mid-70s and could no longer undertake the rigors of war. He retired and spent his last years at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He lived long enough to see Union victory in 1865 and died the following year at the age of 79. The Civil War featured a long list of leaders who cut their teeth in the Mexican-American War. Many of the men who worked together against Mexico would find themselves on opposite sides in the 1860s. It was in Mexico where Grant and Lee first met, and where Lee first worked with Stonewall Jackson. Sherman, George McClellan, George Meade, Ambrose Burnside, Jefferson Davis, James Longstreet, Joseph Johnston, and many others saw action in Mexico. Through their leaders like Taylor and Scott, they learned about military leadership and strategy. And while Polk was president, two members of Congress became well acquainted with each other. One was Abraham Lincoln, and the other was Alexander Stephens. One became the President of the United States, and the other became the Vice President of the Confederacy. President Truman, an avid reader of history, once described James K. Polk as, quote, a great president because he, quote, said what he intended to do and did it. Historians generally agree, often ranking Polk among the most effective of American presidents. When studying Polk's presidency, it's hard to disagree. Polk had four major objectives coming into the presidency: acquire California, obtain a settlement with Britain over the Oregon Territory, establish an independent treasury, and lower the tariff. Polk achieved all four in the space of just 4 years. And he also acquired the enormous New Mexico Territory and completed Tyler's goal to annex Texas. And we haven't even mentioned the fact that under Polk, the U.S. Naval Academy and the Smithsonian Institute were established. Under Polk, the United States grew by more than 1 million square miles. I once heard a famous epitaph that I always felt applied perfectly for Polk. It goes, quote, if you seek his monument, look around you. There's no famous national monument or memorial to James K. Polk. When you come to D.C., you can see the Washington Monument and the Jefferson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and FDR memorials. An Eisenhower memorial is being planned, but there is no Polk memorial. Presidents James Madison, Andrew Jackson, Grover Cleveland, and William McKinley are all on dollar bills, but James Polk is not. Many presidents live on in America's national memory. Many of them have reached iconic status, but not Polk. Even William Howard Taft has become a mascot for the Washington Nationals baseball team, but Polk enjoys no such honor. There are no famous speeches that are attributed to Polk, no famous legends or myths. In the popular mind, James Polk is pretty much forgotten. Perhaps some of this is attributable to Polk himself. Polk was a humorless man with little charisma. Historian Robert Mary described a story when, as president, Polk witnessed a juggler perform in front of hundreds of people. Although the crowd was thoroughly entertained, Polk later wrote that the performance did little for its, quote, edification or profit, and that he considered the time watching it, quote, unprofitably spent. Polk was a highly competent and determined individual. He was a notorious workaholic with buckets of confidence and determination. He was somebody people knew could get the job done, but he was not someone that they cared to get to know personally. With all of that said, if you want to see James Polk's monument, look at a map of the United States. Under his presidency, America grew by over 1 million square miles. If you have a second, just picture the following states: Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, Oregon, Idaho, Washington, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. Imagine all that land, and think that had it not been for James Polk, their admission into the Union might not have been a sure thing, at least not in the way that it happened. When one studies America's rise to a world power, President Polk emerges as one of its greatest architects. All this, despite being one of the unlikeliest dark horse candidates to ever win the presidency. And think also about this. James Polk had 4 major goals when he came into office, and he achieved all 4 of them. In fact, he achieved more than just those 4, and he did so while imposing a term limit on himself. How often do we find ourselves disappointed by politicians on how they promise so much and deliver on so little? When we consider that, Polk's achievement becomes all the more remarkable. And before you think that times were necessarily different, don't forget the outright insubordination Polk faced from his own generals and his own Secretary of State, or the numerous leaks that embarrassed his administration. Remember how hard it is to run a war or conduct diplomacy at a time when it took weeks and months for messages to go back and forth. Remember how Polk's own envoy to Mexico disobeyed his orders and the political challenges he faced from anti-war politicians in his own party, the frustrations he felt while dealing with the highly unstable, unreliable, and corrupt Mexican government. By the time Polk left his short presidency, he was physically broken and had only 3 months to live. When you look at a map of the United States, remember that our 11th president worked himself to death to obtain it. But Polk also has his critics. After all, there was a cost to his decisions. About 13,000 Americans and 15,000 Mexicans died from the war. The nation spent about $100 million to finance it. And there were those who believed that Polk was guilty of starting an immoral war. And those critics are not easily dismissed. They include historical giants like Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant. In his famed memoir, Grant later wrote that Taylor's mission to the Rio Grande was done to provoke a war with Mexico and silence domestic opposition to the war. He wrote, quote, "To this day, I regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker power." In 2008, former Vice President Al Gore gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention and referenced the Mexican-American War, saying it was, quote, "condemned by history," and paralleled Lincoln's opposition to the war with Barack Obama's opposition to the Iraq invasion of 2003. For Mexico, the war was a disaster. Less than a quarter century after winning independence from Spain, they had lost a massive amount of highly lucrative territory. For many Mexicans and Americans too, the war was an act of clear aggression. And there is much supporting this argument. Some historians believe that Polk very deliberately provoked a war with Mexico to provide the pretext for conquering its territory. It's hard to argue otherwise. Whether or not such an action was justified should always take into account the many details that have been brushed over. First, as I've stated many times, Mexico was highly unstable, unreliable, and corrupt. From 1821 to 1876, the Mexican presidency changed hands 75 times. During the same time, the American presidency changed 13 times in peaceful, regular elections. This made Mexican rule over any territory highly undesirable. Second, in the years before the war, many Mexican citizens and officials committed acts of violence against Americans and other foreign citizens, and the government of Mexico City was unwilling or unable to make restitution. Third, Mexico lost Texas in part because it had promised autonomy only to renege under Santa Anna. This was the major cause of the Texas War of Independence. Fourth, Mexico herself was not immune to the allure of annexation. In 1822, she annexed the Federal Republic of Central America, which includes Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Fifth, the United States did covet Mexican lands, but for many years before Polk and during Polk's presidency, it tried many times to come to a financial settlement. It even did so multiple times during the war. Now, I'm not saying that these facts address the criticisms of Polk's war. Besides, these all introduce questions of proportionality. Were the grievances Americans had toward Mexico worthy of war? Either way, these details do paint a more complicated picture of what happened. And you also have to remember, with the United States thriving as a republic and Mexico languishing, it isn't reasonable for many Americans to believe that these territories were better off under the American flag. And then, of course, was the issue of slavery. By expanding the country, Polk did what he never wished to do, bring slavery to the forefront of the national debate. It was an issue he tried to avoid, and once it became central to the entire war, he tried to diffuse it. It's hard to imagine the issue not coming to the forefront as long as Polk sought to acquire new territory. History records that his greatest success is forever intertwined with America's greatest sin, which would ultimately be settled by the outbreak of the Civil War. But it must be asked, could history have happened any other way? Could Polk have achieved what he did without provoking the great issue of slavery? It's as if history destined his presidency as just another stop on the path towards his country's greatest cataclysm. Perhaps that is Polk's greatest contribution in our country's history. Without the Mexican-American War, perhaps the slavery issue doesn't come to the forefront when it does. Maybe the Civil War does happen, but not in 1861. Perhaps it happens at a later date, past the time of Lincoln, Grant, Lee, and Sherman. Who knows what would have happened then? When we think of it that way, Polk irreparably altered the fate of the nation. It's easy to compare Polk's war with the 2003 Iraq invasion. In both cases, neither were clear wars of necessity. To many, they were wars of choice, not wars of last result. As I read about the debates during the Mexican-American War, I was struck at just how similar they were to the ones I heard in 2003. They both involved accusation that the war was started on false pretenses, that greed was the true reason we went to war. But there's a big difference. Polk's war was a clear success, while the outcome of George W. Bush's war remains, for many, ambiguous. The victory over Mexico remains the greatest reason why Polk places highly in presidential rankings. But it has me wondering, does a war become right according to history because it ends well? And if that's the case, do we have to think more meaningfully about war? I mean, right before we go into war, doesn't the debate focus on whether or not it is the right thing to do? But by the time it ends, it seems that all goes out the window, and all that matters is the outcome. Perhaps Ralph Waldo Emerson best illustrated the moral complexities of Polk's war. Although he rejected war, quote, as a means of achieving America's destiny, Emerson noted that, quote, most of the great results of history are brought about by discreditable means. As I read about Polk's story, I was struck by just how unlikely it was. Polk's era was one of American giants. I've discussed many of them here: Henry Clay, John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Winfield Scott, and many others. And yet none of these men became president. They are often discussed as potential presidents and ran many times. They were far more famous than Polk, but it was Polk who became president, and arguably ended up having the biggest legacy. The life of James Polk testifies to one of the greatest lessons in history, that the most unexpected and unlikeliest individuals can emerge and leave the biggest imprint on their times. If you'd like to learn more about President Polk and the Mexican-American War, check out A Country of Vast Designs by Robert W. Merry. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal. Thanks to my dad, Bert Chu. The music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters. You too can support us by going to patreon.com/thisamericanpresident and giving any amount you choose per episode that we release. If you like what you've been hearing, you can also help us by sharing an episode on Twitter or Facebook. I'm Richard Lim. We're back next time with more This American President.